Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. I'm Elizabeth. This video introduces the story behind the psalm level semantics for Psalm 1. Anytime somebody says something such as, "The wicked are like chaff," there's always background information that is anticipated the audience will already have. For people in the ancient Near East, they'd already know, without thinking, that chaff is the outer husks of grain, which are needed to protect the grain during growing season, but then it's discarded during winnowing. Somebody hearing it said would also infer with certainty that, at least for this speaker, it's meaningful to compare people and chaff. And that person might infer that the speaker is implying that just as the chaff is separated from the grain, so maybe the wicked will be separated from the righteous? The purpose of this layer is to make explicit what's already implicit and what would have occurred automatically to a native speaker. This includes background already assumed by both speaker and hearer, which is here in violet. It also includes what a reader would likely infer from the text, shown here in blue. We actually split this into three categories: common ground, which would be information shared by anyone in ancient Israel; local ground is what can be inferred from the text with certainty, so it depends only on whether or not the text itself is true; and playground is what can also be inferred from the text, but with probability. The rest of the text will either confirm or correct these inferences, also called implicatures for those linguists out there. Picture time. We use triangles to visualize stories, which we define as a sequence of events motivated by tension. On the left-hand upslope are those events which increase the tension. At the top is any turning point, as in stories with a climax, and the right-hand downslope shows those events that decrease the tension. Here, a man rejects the ways of the wicked, and the tension is the expectation that something must come next. What's he going to get from this? Then he meditates on the Lord's instruction. In some stories, this might be another event of increasing tension. In this story, however, it's the turning point. After this, the man causes all he does to flourish. We now know what became of the man, so the literary tension decreases. Explanations are often needed to make sense of stories. We include them here as little explanatory chains. Often, this is made up of common ground assumptions, again, all of which would have been obvious to a native speaker. In this case, the explanatory chain is from explicit text, that the man's delight is in the Lord's instruction, and that's why he ends up meditating on it. The whole point here is to trace the logic of whatever lies behind the text, so we can understand, as a native speaker would have, the connections within the text. Here, the diagram shows that verse 2a, the man's delight, is the cause for the man's meditating, verse 2b, and that meditating on the Lord's instruction is the turning point on the path of flourishing. We've anticipated the story of the man introduced at the beginning of the psalm. As the semantic logic of the psalm goes, this man rejects the ways of the wicked, then meditates on the Lord's instruction, and so he ends up flourishing. The rejecting the ways of the wicked is placed in its own triangle, showing that there's actually an embedded mini-story. Let's look more closely at that. Here, we actually have a negated story, meaning a story triangle with a big red cross over it. The embedded story is of a man who does walk in the counsel of the wicked, stand in the path of sinners, and settle in the dwelling of insolent people. The end of the story is not explicit in the text, but there's a clear playground inference. He develops a character antithetical to God's desire. Remember, it's in light blue and in parentheses to show that it's part of the playground, not the text itself. The story of one who embraced wicked ways is rejected by the man, and we summarize that as we move on to the next level. Another story is implied by verse 3. There's mention of a transplanted tree that gives fruit in its season, whose leaf does not wither, and which makes all of its produce flourish. All of that, however, belongs on the right side of the triangle. From it, we can infer the full story. If it were transplanted, and see our lexical semantics for the full analysis of that word, then the tree initially was in a place without much water. We can infer that with some probability. That's why it's in the light blue. Then it was removed from the waterless place and transplanted by water. Hooray! That's what makes all the difference. The water now causes the tree to flourish. The triangle is colored in dark blue to show that the turning point is a local ground inference. Now we're going to jump a bit ahead of ourselves. The story behind includes the whole understanding of how water causes trees to flourish. The text makes use of this when it says that the tree is like a man transplanted by water. That's surrounded with dashed lines to indicate that it's not really the story behind. We just want to show how the story behind ends up being used. It connects the story of the tree with the story of the man. Specifically, the story of the tree's flourishing with the story of the man's flourishing. We can readily understand that water makes all the difference to a tree's flourishing. If water is like the Lord's guidance or instruction, then that's why the man who meditates on it ends up flourishing. The image and story of the tree provide the explanation and legitimation for the story of human flourishing. The next story is that of chaff. The wind blows away the chaff. This one was a commonplace in the agrarian society of the ancient Near East. The chaff starts out as the outer husks on the grain, which protect the grain as it grows. Once the grain is harvested, though, the husks have to be cracked and separated out because they're no good to eat. Threshing cracks the husks and starts separating the husks, now known as chaff, from the grain. The end result is that in winnowing, the wind can blow away the chaff, since it's so lightweight, and the useful grain is what's left. Here, the triangle is in gray to show that the turning point is a common ground assumption. Now, we can build on the story of the chaff. If the wicked are like chaff, then a playground inference is that the righteous are like grain. As in, chaff is a term used to compare the useless part of grain, only worth discarding, to the useful and edible part of the grain, which gets stored away. The inference is that the wicked is being used to compare to another term. In the world of the Psalms, that other term is the righteous. Now, we see how the psalmist builds on the story of the chaff. If the wicked are like chaff and the righteous are like grain, then that builds a new story that makes sense of verse 5. The wicked start out alongside the righteous, as the chaff start out alongside the grain. But then comes judgment, and the wicked and righteous are separated. The wicked condemned, and the righteous acquitted. The end result for the wicked is that they don't survive. They're separated out, so they can't even stand in the congregation of the righteous. This is using the story behind as the building blocks, which end up enabling us to see more of the story within. So this triangle is in light blue, because the turning point is a playground inference. Here is the full picture of how the chaff not surviving the winnowing process, together with the claim that the wicked are like chaff, provides the explanation for why the wicked will not survive the Lord's winnowing process. Here's the summary. There are 4 mini-stories here of 4 different kinds. One is common ground. Chaff does not survive the winnowing process. One is local ground, in dark blue. Water causes trees to flourish, according to this psalm. One is playground, in light blue. The wicked do not survive God's winnowing process, if we've made the right inferences. And one is explicit in the text itself, that devotion to the Lord's instruction causes a man to flourish. The color of each triangle tells you just how far behind the text the story is. The story of chaff is just part of the culture. The story of the trees is assumed within this psalm, but not a surprise to the culture. The story of the wicked not surviving is only inferred with a string of inferences. And the story of the Lord's instruction, causing a man to flourish, is explicit in the text, but it's buttressed by the tree story. Now we can understand the semantic logic that lies behind what the psalm is doing. When the psalmist says that the man following the Lord's instruction is like a tree by water, we know that already implicit is the background knowledge that water causes trees to flourish. What is inferred, and how the poet builds on top of this, is that if that man is like a tree, then it's the Lord's instruction that will cause the man to flourish. And when the psalmist says that the wicked are like chaff, We know that the background implicit is that chaff is the part that does not survive the winnowing process. What we infer is then that the wicked, if like chaff, will not survive a winnowing process to which they will be subjected. In the psalm, that's the judgment court. There's another layer of logic, beginning with the opening words and ending with verse 6. This is the whole question of what it means to call someone happy and why you should do so. The story of the first 3 verses is that since everybody knows that one whose position in life is admirable and desirable should be called blessed or happy, and because the righteous become like that, we ought to call them happy. Remember how saying the wicked were like chaff implied a comparison between the wicked and righteous? The canonical context of Psalm 1, as in the chapters immediately preceding it in the canon, provide a comparison for us. Malachi 3:15 reads, "But now we call the arrogant happy. Certainly evildoers prosper. And even when they put God to the test, they get away with it." That tells a very different story. If we were in Malachi, this would all be in black. But because we're in Psalm 1, this can only be playground inferences. We have the same starting point, that the one who is admirable is called happy. But then we have the inference that sometimes it's the wicked who seem admirable and desirable. That would lead to the wicked being declared happy. We'll look to the discourse layer to see how the thrust of the psalm is precisely to counter this idea. Here, we just look at the semantic logic. That logic is provided in verse 6. The Lord cares for the righteous people, and that's why they prosper. That's what makes it so that those who follow the Lord's instruction prosper. By contrast, the way of the wicked people will come to an end. That means that in the end, they do not prosper, so they should not be considered happy. We have to reject that storyline. So goes the logic in the psalm. Now, we can see all the logic that is at play here in Psalm 1. The Lord cares for the righteous people, and that's why they prosper, and that's why they're called happy, to be admired. By contrast, the wicked won't make it through winnowing, that is, judgment, and that's why they'll come to an end, and that's why they are not to be admired. As you can see from the triangles, the logic is not symmetric, but once you've grasped this logic, you're ready to read Psalm 1 with deep understanding. This has been the story behind Psalm 1. Thanks for watching, and please go to www.cdbr.org if you'd like more information. There's a lot more on this psalm and others. Thanks.